aviation disasters. August 9th, 1978. A fully loaded Boeing 747 is taking off at Athens International Airport. It's departing the runway over one of the world's oldest and most populous cities. Suddenly, the thrust of the engines drops and becomes insufficient to continue the flight. Reconstruction of events. 1978, Greece, 4 years ago. Olympic Airways became the property of the Greek government. The previous owner, shipping magnate Onassis, sold it after his only son Alexander died in an aircraft accident. He was piloting a small private jet that crashed during the takeoff. The huge Boeing 747-200 is the jewel of Olympic Airways. It was used on the most prestigious routes, including the direct flight from Athens to New York JFK. The first Boeing 747 purchased by the airline was named Olympic Zeus, in honor of the Greek god of the sky, thunder, and lightning. A crew of 3 operates this aircraft. However, the flight will take more than 9 hours, so an additional pilot also has to be on board. As a result, there are 3 captains in the cockpit. The captain, Siphis Migadis, is very experienced. Ex-military pilot, 32 years of work in the company. His close friend, Kostas Fakardos, also a captain, but performs the functions of first officer for this flight, and the one more pilot, Captain Trilvos. A flight engineer also was with them. Athens is characterized by a very complex meteorology. The mountains, the seas, and the hot climate bring many features that must be taken into account during the takeoff. It is very hot outside, 43 degrees Celsius. It is difficult for airplanes to fly in such weather. Hot air is less dense than cold air, and airplanes have nothing to lean on. You have to add more thrust to the engines to maintain lift and stay airborne. The Boeing 747 has 4 engines. Today, for technical reasons, the second engine can only operate at 96%. The plane is fully loaded. 418 American tourists are flying from Greece. For this long flight, the captain takes 140 tons of fuel. The total weight of the aircraft becomes 350 tons. To lift that much weight requires maximum engine thrust at the takeoff. Pratt & Whitney engines had one feature. Their power was limited by temperature. If you turn them on full thrust, the temperature would rise so high that the engines would begin to break down. That's why the engines had a cooling system at maximum thrust. It is controlled by the flight engineer, who switches it on before the takeoff roll. 4 green lights show the flight engineer that the system is running and the water glycol mixture cools down the engines. Also, there were a lot of drawbacks to using this system. The water glycol mixture started to cool down the engines after 2.5 minutes, so the system had to be switched on at a particular moment. It was necessary to carefully monitor the exhaust gas temperature, because if one of the water pumps failed during takeoff roll, some engines could fail due to overheating. In addition, this cooling system was not used very often, and many crews were not familiar with it. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, an Olympic Airways Flight 411 aligned to the runway ready for takeoff. Captain Migadis tells the flight engineer to switch on the cooling system as soon as the takeoff roll begins. The airplane accelerates and reaches V1 speed. At this point, the captain has to make a decision whether to continue the takeoff or not. Migadis continues, and then the engine number 3 fails. Part of it starts to fall down onto the runway, but it is impossible to stop the takeoff. The airplane will roll out of the runway and crash into the buildings. Perhaps the flight engineer accidentally switched off the cooling system of the 3rd engine, or there was a pump failure. But in any case, there are only 3 engines remaining. one of which is not working at full thrust. The aircraft can't gain altitude. It flies over the airfield's 6-meter fence and heads towards downtown Athens. The Boeing is flying very low, almost touching the roofs of houses. Migades tries to lift this behemoth higher, but the thrust of the engines is not enough. The captain asks the flight engineer to check if the cooling system is working. But in the stress situation, the flight engineer gets confused and finally switches it off. The airplane miraculously stays airborne. The captain asks for the gear up. First Officer Fakardos hesitates with the instruction. The thing is that according to the guidance, the landing gear should not be retracted at this moment, because the opened landing gear doors will create additional drag. The aircraft will lose speed and may stall. It is recommended to wait for the airplane to gain speed and altitude, and only then to retract the landing gear. After a slight moment of hesitation, Fakardos follows the captain's order. The aircraft stays airborne, but flies over the buildings and blows off several antennas. Captain Migades knows that 2 miles ahead there is a 60 meters high hill in downtown Athens, and he's heading straight to it. He can't turn away, because turning would reduce the area on which the airplane's wings lean on and the lift would drop. It has to be compensated by the increased speed, which they don't have. In addition, because of the aileron deflection, air resistance increases. Whenever Migades tries to turn, the airplane starts to shake so that the captain feels that it is about to stall. The most he can do is turn 2 degrees to the left, and the speed is already below the limit and continues to drop. The hill is coming up in front of them. The aircraft is still unable to accelerate. The controllers in the air traffic control tower are looking at the Boeing with bated breath and think it is about to crash. Migades has no choice but to gently pull back the yoke to further reduce speed, but try to gain altitude. The cockpit becomes quiet. All 3 pilots are sure they are about to crash, but it doesn't happen. They fly over the hill with only 3 meters to spare. The minimum speed required for the plane to stay airborne is 180 knots, but they're at 158. As soon as they fly over the hill, the airplane begins to gain altitude. Migades feels that he can increase the speed of the aircraft by a little descent. He drops the nose and descends from 64 to 50 meters. The speed increases slightly, but is still well below the stall speed. By all aerodynamics laws, the airplane should have stalled long ago, but it still stays airborne. Most likely they didn't stall because of the ground effect. An air cushion was formed between the wing and the ground, which increased the lift for the Flight 411. But the speed is dropping, and the pilots know if this continues, they will eventually crash. The crew starts looking for a landing site, and the first thing they look at is a large football field. But they still decide to fly to the far side of the city, where there will be no residential buildings. The aircraft flies so low that when it passes a 40-story business center, the flight attendants can see the faces of the people inside. The passengers don't worry, but they also think that flying at low altitude over Athens is an Olympic Airways special offer. The plane has been flying for 5 minutes and still not stalled. At this point, 3 things happen. First, the aircraft leaves downtown Athens behind and the temperature drops from 43 to 38 degrees Celsius. This allows the engines to cool down a bit and produce a little more thrust. Also, the cold air itself is denser and it's easier for the airplane to stay airborne. Second, they fly into an area where the wind slightly increases and becomes a headwind. The air pressure on the airplane increases and thus the instrument speed also goes up. Third, the flight engineer finally turns on the cooling system of the engines and they start working at full thrust. The airplane is gaining the necessary speed. But it's too early to rejoice. They are flying towards the mountains. The captain pulls back his yoke again, but they don't have time to fly over them. But at this speed, they already can maneuver. And they turn into a small valley towards the sea. The pilots start dumping the fuel. Half an hour later, the captain decides to land the still overweight aircraft, but they land safely. The aircraft taxis back to the terminal, and Captain Migadis is surprised to learn that his daughters are at the airport. As soon as the controllers saw the plane disappear over the hill, they decided that it had crashed and sent out the message about this. That same day, alive and unharmed, Migadis still made the flight to New York, but on the other aircraft. When the data about this incident got to the Boeing company, they did not believe it. At 158 knots instead of 180 knots, the aircraft should have crashed. But they tried to recreate the situation on a flight simulator, but time after time the aircraft crashed into the city. It's unknown exactly what actually happened to Flight 411. There is no report of the incident. There was no Airplane Crash Investigation Bureau in Greece at the time. It was created 27 years later, after the Helios Airways crash in 2005.